Halloween Homecoming, an unofficial Halloween web novel by Robert Kask. Part 1, Wake the Dragon. Chapter 1. In the quiet moments of the 11th hour, Haddonfield sat still against the night. The Illinois-based slice of Americana, whose roots could be traced back to colonization, offered no overt clues as to the whereabouts of its 4,000-odd residents, save for the countless rows of cookie-cutter, single-family homes that dotted the rolling emerald landscape. Few too many of these homes had their lights on, and fewer still were left listening to the night sounds, but all were uniquely tied by fate's hands, united by a shared inability to detect the true horrors that occur when the world grows quiet and the moon offers light to her creatures. At the farthest end of her neighborhood's subdivision, in one such aforementioned mass-produced home, desperately in need of a fresh coat of eggshell paint, sitting in a recliner square in the middle of a living room whose floor was equal parts trash and carpet, reclined Norma Elrod, the home's lone occupant. Her flabby and achy legs fought through discarded beer cans, newspapers, and dirty laundry in search of a comfortable position, but quickly gave up, dropping them back onto the floor, only to repeat the process a second and third time, both to the same result. Comfort was a commodity for the young and supple, she would tell herself, but whether she was reaffirming this or simply convincing herself, she couldn't say. She saw no difference. Norma coughed, adding to her discomfort. She heaved a wad of amber-colored phlegm from her throat, loaded it onto a flattened section of her tongue, and promptly ejected it onto the paper plate resting on her lap. Disgusting, she told herself. To make matters worse, Norma noticed the phlegm was the same shade as her water-damaged beige walls, a color she couldn't stand. A napkin in her hand took care of the discolored spit resting along her chin, but the safety of isolation didn't stop the embarrassment, or the disappointment, or the self-loathing. She knew smoking would be the death of her, but if she'd known she'd spend every waking moment struggling to clear her lungs, or if she'd known how ugly it made her feel, she might have stopped. But that window closed more than a decade ago, shut-stuck like the filthy windows of her home. Not that anyone would care what happened to poor, old, widowed Norma Elrod. At least, that's what the self-loathing kept telling her. To an outsider, Mrs. Elrod may have seemed lonely, surrounded by 2-story walls meant to shelter an entire family, with only a warm television set as her only company. But those who knew her recognized her as the sort of woman who loathed company and conversation, especially from children. Mr. Elrod was the single person whose presence she needed. But a foolish decision, one born from the dangerous marriage of a midlife crisis and an overabundance of spending money, left him torn and smeared across 40 feet of asphalt and lodged between the wheels of a semi. So much for sharing the road. To fill the void left by the man whom she devoted her life, Mrs. Elrod turned to the bottle, first as a means to find peace, then later to forget. Truthfully, it never helped with either, but in the end, a sober life wasn't a life worth living, and Mrs. Elrod's self-preservation proved too strong to allow her to quit. Despite the attention she appeared to give the television, inside her mind was blank, numbed from excessive drinking. This, the emptiness of her mind, was her sanctuary, her escape from the office and the oppressive remarks her boss makes about her hair, her demeanor, her work ethic, complaints she knew her male colleagues weren't given. This was her chance to be the judge, to flick through her 70-some TV channels and decide what was worth her time, even if the focus she gave the TV was insincere. It was also her only chance to feel as if time hadn't moved on. Maybe if she pretended the last decade was a nightmare, she'd eventually wake up. Maybe she'd look over and Mr. Elrod would be right there, snapping his finger along to the Mary Tyler Moore theme song, exactly as he used to, as she wanted him to. Another drag from her cigarette and a quick sip from the bottle, and she was back to reality, back to channel surfing, and all thought of Mr. Elrod was shoved to the back of her mind, trapped in a cerebral cage along with every other thought too overwhelming for her breaking brain to process. Norma pressed the clicker once more, and her television screamed back. Dead tonight in Haddonfield after a night of fun and festivities, the TV set proclaimed, grounding Nora from her drunken stupor and forcing a burp from her gut. It couldn't be. It couldn't. In her adventures across cable TV, Norma realized she'd stumbled upon a live news report covering some heinous crime that had occurred on the street she lived on. In fact, she could see the reporter was just outside of the Myers household, which she knew to be visible from her bedroom window, less than 5 minutes away. She sat up, her cracked leather chair creaking like a taut rope, a hiccup escaping from her gut, and twisted the TV set's volume control to its highest setting. Again, for those just tuning in, 3 dead tonight in a Haddonfield spree killing. 18-year-old Judith Doyle and 6-year-old twins Abraham and Josiah Vincent were found slain by Warren County Police tonight in an upstairs bedroom in this suburban home. The reporter, Robert Mundy, made a half-hearted gesture to the household behind him. Cause of death for all 3 appears to be loss of blood brought on by various stab wounds across the 3 victims' bodies. Right now, the culprit is believed to be, shockingly, 11-year-old Michael Courtney Myers, who is alleged to have been under the care of the eldest decedent, 18-year-old Judith, who police say was babysitting the child in the home that night. Authorities confirm he's been taken into custody and is awaiting questioning, though they've not yet stated what the possible motive is. Disturbingly, eyewitnesses claim the boy was still wearing his blood-soaked Halloween costume when he was found roaming the streets of Haddonfield earlier tonight. The dark wouldn't stop Judith, Tommy Doyle told himself as he peered into the night sky through the second-story window of Mrs. Blankenship's Cape Cod-style home. The boy's palms, slick with fear-induced sweat, gripped the windowsill edges for support, further chipping away at the flaking white paint, revealing the old, rotted wood underneath. Curious eyes looked beyond the glass and down both sides of the street before returning to their primary focus, the Myers household. Some time had passed since he saw the final trick-or-treaters make their rounds, and with them went the last porch lights and street lamps, a declaration that the nightly festivities had officially come to an end. There would be no more door-knocking, no more visible October breaths as the children ran themselves into exhaustion, and no more scares to be shared. Despite this, Tommy never spotted his sister returning to the Myers house. Come to think of it, he never saw them leave in the first place, but he was sure they went. As he recalled, she was to take the Myers boy trick-or-treating. Perhaps he changed his mind, or perhaps Judith changed hers. Whatever the case, Lambkin Lane was now steeped in pitch, subject to the moon's light, and tonight the moon was not kind. Be brave, like Judith. He gulped, then winced. Staring out into the darkness had left Tommy's mouth dried with hesitant fear, and the swallowing rubbed the sides of his throat together like pieces of sandpaper. As painful as it was, however, he pushed it aside in fear of dealing with a far more serious matter. If he wanted to see his sister, he'd have to venture out into the dark. That is, if he could gather the resolve to brave the unknown. He massaged his irritated throat, inadvertently smearing the cold sweat from his palms across his neck. You can do this, he told himself, while using the collar of his costume to dry the sweat. Despite his age, a fresh 8 years old, Tommy had an undue wit about him. Where other boys might revel in the freedom of shade and nighttime, Tommy saw inherent fear and danger. To him, the dark was something you were supposed to fear. He'd shoveled enough cereal into his mouth, seen enough milk cartons in the shoveling process, to know that kids go missing in the dead of night. Bad people with bad intentions were never far away, and they'd say anything to be your friend. And Tommy didn't like the idea of spending the rest of his life on the back of someone else's milk carton. What's worse, Haddonfield was a town that loved myth, legend, and superstition, and Mrs. Blankenship, a buzz of a woman, was easily one of the worst culprits. Because of her tribal enthusiasm for tall tales, all local kids in her babysitting care were subject to endless stories of the town's darker side. From the vengeful spirits of the Barnes witch trials to the bloody story of Madman Bowles. All the stories ended the same, though, with a condemning statement made about the actions of a misbehaved child, indicating they're directly at fault for the preceding horrors. Again, due to the boy's undue wit, Tommy understood they were simply stories used to scare bad kids. No one ever actually gets haunted or cursed. Not that he'd heard of, anyway. This knowledge didn't necessarily comfort him, but he reasoned that if these stories are real, it at least leaves room for Santa to be real too, and that did comfort him. It wasn't the moral fables that interested him anyway, but rather the tales surrounding the origins of Halloween, the Celtic people, and their beliefs regarding the living and the dead. While other kids begged their parents for flashy, store-bought costumes, Tommy knew that, thanks to Mrs. Blankenship's oral history lessons, an animal skin would be more appropriate for the holiday. Unable and unwilling to take the hide from a real wolf, he resorted to asking his mother for a simple, hand-sewn wolf costume, though he had hoped the spirits wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Ultimately, though, the sewing task would fall to his older sister, Judith. At the time, Tommy was ecstatic at the news, knowing it would give him a reason to bug and bother his favorite person in the whole world. But despite the costume turning out leagues better than he'd ever hoped, Judith wasn't here to enjoy the fruits of her labor. Instead, she was across the street, watching the Myers boy play in whatever cheap costume his parents picked out for him at the nearest drugstore, which could in no way ever beat Tommy's costume. "It's just across the street," he told himself. "It's not too far. You're fast. You can outrun anyone." Though he didn't mention it to his parents or Judith, Tommy found it odd that little Mikey's parents requested he trick-or-treat alone. He recalled being jealous that the Myers boy would have Judith all to himself during what was Tommy's favorite holiday, but as he gave it more thought, he suspected Mikey may be shy. Perhaps he asked for Judith's escort personally, and was embarrassed of anyone else finding out. After all, he wouldn't be the first of Tommy's friends to have a crush on Judith, though Tommy wasn't quite sure he'd consider the Myers boy a friend. Not yet, anyway. As quietly as he could, he navigated down the staircase and unlocked the front door and scrambled out into the dark. In just a few hurried steps, he was across the street and standing in the grass of the Myers house, letting the dew seep into the feet of his pajamas. Tommy crept to the back of the home, as he was familiar enough with the family to know their back door was always unlocked. "I hope Judith brought popcorn," Tommy thought as he grabbed for the doorknob, only to find it was locked. Nothing to worry about. Tommy simply knocked his fist against the door. "Judith," he whispered. His reply came just a moment later, as he pressed his ear to the door. A heavy crash, like something falling to the floor, shook the home. Like a bag of candy, Tommy hoped. With only guesses as to what treats little Mikey and his sister had rounded up during the night, Tommy sprinted round to the front of the house, nearly tripping over the rotted wood of the top step. He righted himself with all the grace an 8-year-old could muster, leapt from the far edge of the porch over to the welcome mat, and proudly knocked once more. "Judith!" Again, the same reply, though this time it sounded further. Was someone moving the candy? Tommy wondered if they were attempting to hide it before they opened the door. Sure, he had his own bag at home, but wouldn't little Mikey want to share or trade? Come to think of it, Tommy didn't know what candy the older boy liked. Maybe he'd give Tommy all of his peanut butter cups. Those were his favorite. Whatever he shared, Tommy hoped it had chocolate in it. Impatiently, the boy groaned and fought with the doorknob, quickly freeing the door and throwing it inward, revealing a darkened hallway. The blackness filled the interior of the doorframe completely and unnervingly. Tommy placed a curled hand on his chin and bottom lip, a reflexive, childish instinct, and struggled to make anything out in the abyss. His eyes narrowed and caught the hint of a shape. Not a shape. A glow? Something faint and sterling, like the moon through fog. Tommy squinted his eyes, straining the muscles in his sockets, begging to see something. For a moment, his nose caught the hint of pennies. "Judith?" he fearfully whispered. Again, the hefty thump replied. An unlit room would never stop Judith, Tommy told himself. But something had stopped Judith. She was somewhere in this void, and she wasn't responding to Tommy's calls. But that meant Michael was somewhere inside too. "Michael!" he called into the darkness, hoping to hear the boy's voice, hoping to hear anything. Then the glow from before began to brighten. A bulb, perhaps? In the middle of the room? Maybe it was a lamp. At this point, The nightfall air was beginning to slither its way up Tommy's backside, slipping past his neck and clawing down into his sleeves, yanking at his hairs. The silence of the night grew increasingly louder. Tommy leaned in to see what light could be at the center of the Myers' living room. Was Judith playing with the dimmer switch, trying to scare him? It was working, he thought. Not sure what else to do, and not wanting to be rude and come in unannounced, Tommy gripped the doorframe, craned his neck inside, and found all the answers he wasn't looking for. Little Mikey Myers stepped into view of Tommy, the glow of the moon providing the younger boy with a full reveal of his clown regalia. What he thought to be a bulb, he found to be the pearlescent moonlight reflecting off of a silver domino mask fixed to the older boy's face. A flowing, multicolored clown outfit fit too loosely across his frame. Oversized shoes fitted over top of children's sneakers. His sleeves opened with furls and trim, decorating his hands like ceremonial robes. His fingers anxiously flexed, then calmed, then flexed. Tommy's eyes opened fully to take in the visage of the other boy. The clown costume shimmered with excitement, eagerly rippling across the boy's frame with every breath of air, crashing at his oversized shoes. A big, bulbous red nose sat at the tip of the silver domino mask, dripping with... Was that paint? Tommy wondered, one of many fleeting and terrifying questions that flooded his mind. Behind Michael, Tommy could make out the stairway to the second floor. He wasn't sure how he'd missed it before. Lodged within the railings, he saw something bulky and misshapen, slowly writhing back and forth, as if it were breathing. Michael took another step, savoring this one more than the last, and finally revealing his full form in the lunar light, exposing the being for all that he was. Claw marks and bruising on his face, hair thrown in every direction. His right sleeve, which should have been neon yellow like the left, was striking and garish with hot red paint splashed across. His hands, neck, and face were similarly struck by the paint splatter. In Michael's hand, Tommy saw the knife. A kitchen utensil, one Tommy had seen his mother use countless times before to prepare dinner. His eyes watered, first at what he thought to be terror, then, he realized, because of the pungent metallic odor in the air, floating around the masked clown before him. His nose couldn't lie. Just that summer, while learning to ride his bike without training wheels, he took a serious tumble through a neighbor's backyard. In his panic, he'd managed to split his forearm open, showering his mouth and eyes with sticky, bitter blood. He'd tasted so much, swallowed just as much, that it made him ill. His mouth corroborated what his nose told him, confirming his worst fears. Little Mikey was drenched in fresh blood. Tommy began to moan, then whimper, then cry. A sharp spit of breath whipped through his chattering teeth as he tried to speak. Michael? But that was all Tommy had a chance to mutter before little Mikey rocked forward, raising his knife. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Trick or treat! A trio of teens in ghoulish garb cried out, their voices bouncing throughout the hospital hallways like pebbles down a well. Smith's Grove Psychiatric Hospital was no stranger to monsters. Housed within its stark white walls were a select few of the state's worst offenders. But these monsters weren't born from that same depravity. Instead, these monsters were born from the minds of dreamers and artists. The ghosts and goblins commonly found in late-night creature features whose monstrosities were keenly observed by children and teens worldwide. Even this wasn't new to Dr. Loomis. This was Smith's Grove's 7th annual Teens and Tweens Halloween party, after all. But the atmosphere was decidedly different. The clean white walls were once more decorated with the Halloween-themed paper crafts, pumpkins, bats, and witches' hats, and hospital administrator Terrence Wynn had taken it upon himself to provide a slew of carnival-style games. The younger patients, the only ones allowed to participate, bobbed for apples and pinned tails on donkeys, and traveled door to door in search of candy from the staff. They were laughing, singing, dancing. They were healing. Still, Loomis recognized something lingering in the air, in the halls, like a bad smell threatening to overwhelm the senses if one were too careless. Where there was a stench, there was something rotten, waiting to be found, and Loomis knew exactly what rot had infected the hospital. The good doctor met the trick-or-treaters' excitement with a warm smile and feigned amusement. Their costumes were entirely homemade, no doubt by Nurse Chambers, yet had an unmistakable charm in them that Loomis felt missing in your run-of-the-mill, drugstore-bought, mass-produced Halloween costumes. All three were blanketed in flowing bedsheets, hemmed and stitched in various places to better contour to their bodies, forming the childlike illusions of a ghost, a mummy, and a Raggedy Ann doll, respectively. He scooped up a handful of candy from the pocket of his overcoat and divided it between them, letting the pieces fall into their pillowcases with a hard plastic patter, and praised each of them for their terrific outfits. The teens thanked the good doctor before darting off to the next office door, eagerly awaiting new treats and praise. Loomis knew these teens well: Penny, Sasha, and Jaquim. They had all arrived within the same few months, and had formed a strong bond because of it, a skill Loomis recognized to be essential for surviving behind the prison-like walls of Smith's Grove. It was a skill he wished his own patient had, not for survival's sake, but for proof of his patient's humanity. Loomis let the office door shut before allowing his jovial smile to fade, revealing the scouring old man that hid beneath, an old man whose warnings had gone unheeded for 4 years, whose efforts to keep evil imprisoned had only emboldened it, strengthened it. He slumped forward, his forehead pressing the door tighter against the frame. All around him was the typical decor of a psychiatrist's office. That is to say, it was filled with bland furniture, framed accolades, and visual aids used to assist in medical explanations. Behind Loomis, a young man was seated in front of a barred window, peering through the courtyard's trees and off into an unknowable distance. His standard issue scrubs were pristine, devoid of the same wear found on the scrubs of his peers, which the staff cited as a sign of good behavior. Loomis knew better. He recognized the young man's inhuman patience as something to be alarmed by. Perhaps, he would think to himself when alone, they just don't want to see it. The young man's breath came in evenly spaced intervals, when it came at all. He'd sat in that same leather chair 2 hours a day, every day for 4 years, while Loomis fruitlessly attempted to wriggle his breeches into the young man's mind for some semblance of emotion. "I'm sorry, Michael," he lied. Loomis never took his head off the door as he spoke, unwilling or unable to face his patient. His forehead wrinkled and creased under the weight of his burdens, and his hand slipped into the warm recess of his coat pocket, where he traced his trembling fingers along the hammer of a concealed Smith & Wesson revolver. With self-aware amusement, he continued, "I know how much you enjoy Halloween." Michael's eyes remained locked onto some far-flung objective beyond the forest outside. His muscles remained completely rigid underneath the all-white scrubs. His fingers, however, gave the slightest tremble, a spark of anticipation for things to come. Perhaps, if Loomis could stomach the sight of his greatest failure, he'd have noticed. Now alone in Loomis's office, illuminated only by a single garish, strobing fluorescent bulb and hidden by the cacophony of screams that ravaged the halls outside, Michael drifted like a phantom, closing in on his target with unnatural calmness. He'd been here before, done this before. His hand curled around the handle of the chef's knife, his thumb bracing his finger so as not to let it slip, and his eyes never once moved from their fixed gaze. Memories of a slender, supple Judith Doyle flooded the caverns of his mind. Her rosy fragrance listing underneath his nose, her milky skin ruined by countless lacerations and free-flowing rivers of red. With steady aim and evenly paced breath, Michael rocked his arm back, winding up for the attack. Schlick! Upon impact, Michael's thighs quivered, tensing and releasing with every dull pulse stemming from the contraband blade in his hand. Outside the office, the emergency lights flashed quickly, filling the hallway with a deep red, hiding the streaks, smears, and splashes of blood that cut the floors and walls. At one end, an orderly called out for help as she tried to quell the profuse bleeding from Penny's neck, while another rushed to preserve what little gray matter was left inside of Jaquin's open head from spilling out onto the sanguine-covered hospital floors. A third orderly, who had been carrying Sasha's upper half against his fat belly in search of Dr. Wynne, came crashing down when he unexpectedly found her lower half with his foot. Her head burst open underneath the weight of the man, forcing from him an agonized and remorseful shriek and several subsequent sobs. Inside the office, Michael's knuckles spasmed as he felt his target shudder under the force of his hand. A lonely jack-o'-lantern atop Loomis's desk. His fist flexed with incredible force, and again he reared his arm back. Again he struck the effigy. Schlick! Michael briefly flicked his eyes to the right, studying his arm as if looking to improve his form, before letting it sink into the pumpkin once more. Schlick! 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 When his hands finally loosened from the knife, the pumpkin was little more than orange rind shards, pulps, and seeds. Its innards stained his hands and sleeves, creating a shocking contrast to the ivory clothing and walls that kept him shackled. It was a dark work of art that only Michael could understand, a macabre fancy he coveted like a thief to a diamond. Outside the office, Michael could hear the crazed yells of his doctor. "Where is he? Where has the evil gone?" Michael never needed to see Loomis, let alone hear him, to know when he was nearby. He knew Loomis had been upstairs only moments before, locked in a physical embrace with Nurse Chambers, pretending the world couldn't hear their hushed, honeyed words. He knew the length the doctor took to conceal his movements, keeping his physical relationship to the nurse a secret. Michael saw everything Loomis did, watched every second of time around himself in his new temporary dwelling. He saw their dalliance, witnessed their expression, and when he knew they were all but overtaken, he rose from his perch at the window and began his own Halloween festivities. "Here, the footprints lead this way," another orderly called out in response to Loomis's pleas. The brass doorknob throttles and shakes, first rhythmically, then desperately. "Stand back!" Loomis was on the other side of the door now. Twin gunshots ripped through the air and the doorknob dropped to the floor, crumpled and red hot. The door flew open to reveal the old fool and several more orderlies, all ready to pounce on the perpetrator. But vengeance would not win today. Michael was long gone. Through an open window, the wheat smell of the Illinois grain fields wafted in, bringing with it a biting draft. The curtains billowed inward like the stretched-out arms of a bedsheet ghost. Dancing trees swayed to and fro as if to celebrate the young inmate's newfound freedom. Smith's Grove's blaring sirens like a rejoicing chorus for his escape. Loomis gripped the windowsill and stuck his entire upper half out, scanning the length of the street for his patient. He's gone from here," he cried out into the night air for all to hear, a warning for the world, one he begged wouldn't go unheeded this time. Loomis had spent 4 years convincing the hospital administration of Michael's inhumanity, of his need to kill. He spent 4 years bartering for safer holding conditions, stricter enforcements, and more vigilant observation. Loomis had wasted 4 years trying to imprison evil, but in this moment, he knelt before evil's proclamation. Streaked across the far wall in a sickening mixture of blood and pumpkin guts was a single word, scribbled with fervent care and darkly beautiful penmanship. Home. "The evil is gone from here," Loomis sobbed. No sooner had Loomis jammed his revolver into his mouth than the orderlies wrestled him to the ground, prying it from his iron grip and passing fresh blood from lab coat to lab coat. "The evil is gone!" Screeching tires ripped through the night air, revealing to the staff Michael's means of escape. To the unfathomable shock of everyone, the boy was driving. The evil is gone. The good doctor repeated this again and again and again until his sobs choked him and his voice failed under the weight of his mistakes. End of chapter 2.